Picture the screen still black, the soundtrack quiet, and a single question drifting in like a whisper that has haunted human thought for millennia. Did nothing ever exist? Truly, absolutely, in any sense that would satisfy both a philosopher in a candlelit study and a physicist standing before a particle accelerator humming in the dark. And as you listen, you are pulled backward, not just through years, but into a world before worlds, when the very idea of nothing is so strange that people cannot yet name it without turning it into a story. Long before anyone spoke of quantum fields or gravitational singularities, there were cold nights around fires where the sky above seemed a cavern of infinite black, and the people staring upward tried to imagine what lay beyond the last visible star. And because true emptiness was inconceivable, they filled the darkness with water, with monsters, with sleeping gods, anything but a perfectly blank absence of being. So the Babylonian priests who watched the same stars from their ziggurats wrote that, in the beginning, there was not nothing, but the mingling of Apsu and Tiamat, sweet and bitter waters entwined, a chaos, yes, but a pregnant one. In the Egyptian temples, beneath colossal stone ceilings painted with constellations, scribes carved into stone that before the first sunrise there was none, the dark, endless water, a formless sea that was not an empty void but an immense, fertile reservoir from which the first mound of land rose and the creator god stood up like a man awakening from sleep. So for them, before the world never meant a bare mathematical zero. It meant an unorganized, dimly conscious liquidity waiting to be spoken into order by names and rituals. The Hebrew poets who composed the opening lines of Genesis stood on that same ancient stage and, in their own austere language, wrote that the earth was tohu vabohu, and darkness was upon the face of the deep, and that deep, the Tehom, still echoes the older Mesopotamian abyss, so that when we hear, "In the beginning God created the heavens and the earth," the text's first listeners did not picture a geometrical nothingness out of which a universe popped like a trick of sleight of hand, but rather the taming of a shadowy, watery, pre-cosmic mess into a home with boundaries, seasons, lamps in the sky, and names for things. In those early centuries, no one around the Mediterranean shore had yet invented an abstract nothing like a blank set on a blackboard, so even the concept of zero as a number did not exist, and every creation myth you can find in clay tablets or papyrus scrolls begins, not with absolute non-being, but with something indefinite. Darkness that can be lit, water that can be parted, chaos that can remember. When, centuries later, Greek thinkers began to strip away the gods from the sky and replace them with questions sharp enough to cut, they too found themselves circling uneasily around the idea of nothing, unable to rest in it. So Thales of Miletus declared that everything was water, Anaximenes said it was air, and Anaximander, more daring, spoke of the apeiron, the boundless, a kind of unformed, inexhaustible something from which the hot and the cold, the wet and the dry, emerged and to which they would return. And even this most abstract origin was still a plenum, a fullness, not a blank. When Parmenides of Elea stepped into this arena in the 5th century BCE, he did so with the bluntness of a courtroom lawyer telling everyone that the word nothing was not just misleading but literally unthinkable, because, he argued, you cannot speak or think of what is not, since to speak of it is already to treat it as something, and therefore what is, what is not, a phrase that, if taken seriously, slams the door on any notion of creation from nothing, change from nothing, or even the tiniest gap of empty space between things, pinning all reality to an eternal, ungenerated, indestructible being that never began and will never end. Across the sea in Abdera, Democritus and his elusive teacher Leucippus quietly detonated Parmenides' fortress by daring to reintroduce the forbidden thing under a new name, arguing that reality consists of indivisible atoms moving in the void, and that without void, motion would be impossible, because if there were no empty space, objects could not move past one another, so their void was not the metaphysical non-being Parmenides abhorred, but a kind of structured absence, the stage on which atoms dance, an emptiness that has extension, geometry, and the power to allow motion, and this paradoxical something like nothing would haunt physics for the next 2.5 millennia. In Athens, Plato tried to navigate between these extremes by imagining a third thing, the chora, or receptacle, neither pure being nor pure non-being, but a mysterious matrix that receives forms like wax receiving stamps, an invisible nursery of shapes where the eternal ideas of the good and the beautiful imprint themselves upon a sort of pre-cosmic background, and he likened it to a mother whose own nature is difficult to grasp because it is always being reshaped by what it receives, so that even in this lofty metaphysical machinery, the closest concept to nothing is not an annihilating void, but an amorphous. Aristotle, Plato's student and critic, looked at these speculations and turned his attention to what he thought he could classify carefully: substance, motion, place, time, and the physical world in which a stone falls, a flame rises and a bird cuts the air, and for him, the notion of a vacuum was offensive both to reason and to nature. So he taught that nature abhors a vacuum, not as a mere proverb but as a physical principle, arguing that if empty space existed, it would destroy the coherence of motion and measure, because speed would become infinite and force is meaningless. So he filled his cosmos with continuous substance, a stratified universe of earth, water, air, fire, and an outer sphere of ether, where the stars moved in unending circles, leaving no room anywhere for a pocket of true nothingness. His influence spread like ink through the Greek-speaking world, through Alexandria's libraries, through Latin translations into Rome, so that for centuries the official educated view in much of the Mediterranean was that the world is a plenum, completely full, and that any appearance of emptiness, an apparently empty cup, the space between your fingers, the void between celestial spheres, is merely matter so fine, so subtle that you cannot see it, but which nonetheless occupies every region of space. Yet, beneath this philosophical orthodoxy, the atomist remained like a countercurrent, and in the 1st century BCE, the Roman poet Lucretius took Democritus's severe doctrine and turned it into a sweeping epic, De Rerum Natura, where he sings of the infinite void stretching without limit, in which atoms fall and collide like dust motes in a sunbeam, building worlds and destroying them again, and in his verses you can almost see a primitive cinematic pan through endless black airless gulfs where invisible particles flash and combine, and for him that void is more real than any god, because it is the necessary backdrop against which everything that exists can move, merge, and part. As Roman temples filled with images of their gods and early Christian gatherings whispered their new creed in crowded houses, the question of where the world came from grew sharper, because the old cyclical stories of eternal return were giving way to a new, linear narrative that began with a decisive divine act, and the Christian theologians reading Genesis, this creatio ex nihilo crystallized, not in the Hebrew text itself, but in the interpretive tradition around it, as a logical assertion of God's absolute sovereignty. If something, anything, existed alongside God from eternity, then God would no longer be the sole, uncaused source of all. So theologians insisted that before the heavens and the earth, there was not even a dark, roiling ocean of possibility. There was only God, and beyond God, no space, no duration, no substrate. A claim so audacious that even their philosophical opponents steeped in Greek metaphysics were startled by the boldness of an origin without any background. To make this intelligible, thinkers like Augustine of Hippo had to reshape not only cosmology, but the very notion of time, and in his Confessions he imagined someone asking what God was doing before creating the world, then rejects the question as malformed, because he says time itself was created with the world, so that asking about a time before time is like asking where the edge of a circle begins, and in this stroke the old mythic deeps of water are replaced by a more terrifying abyss. The thought of a state in which not only things and places but the when of everything is missing, a nothing without even a waiting room. At roughly the same global moment in the East, Indian philosophers had their own very different confrontation with absence, framed not as a question of cosmic genesis, but as an inquiry into what is real about the self and the world. So in early Upanishadic thought, the universe emerges not from nothing but from Brahman, a limitless spiritual reality that is never absent, and what seems empty or void is the result of Maya, illusion or misperception. But later, in Buddhist traditions that flowered in the centuries after the Buddha's death, a more radical notion, shunyata, emptiness, arose. Not a nothing that pre-exists the world, but a nothingness at the heart of everything, understood as the lack of any fixed independent essence. Nagarjuna in the 2nd century wielded shunyata like a surgical instrument, arguing that all phenomena are empty of inherent existence because they arise only in dependence on causes and conditions, and he pushed language to its limits to show that any attempt to pin down reality as either existing, non-existing, both, or neither collapses, not to reduce the world to nihilistic nothing, but to free the mind from the grip of solid, substantial somethings, so that in this tradition, nothing is not an event at the beginning of time, but a present insight into the way things lack an independent core. Meanwhile, across the mountains and deserts to the west, in the Islamic world of the 8th to 12th centuries, a different encounter with nothingness took place in the bustling courts of caliphs and the quiet cells of theologians, where Greek philosophical texts translated into Arabic in the Bait al-Hikmah of Baghdad met Quranic affirmations that God is the first and the last, and debates broke out between the mutakallimun, the practitioners of kalam, and the falasifa, the philosophers, about whether the universe was created in time or coexisted eternally with God as a necessary emanation. Thinkers from the Mu'tazilite school argued fiercely for a temporal beginning, using logical arguments to show the impossibility of an actual infinite past, and insisting that every contingent thing must have had a first instant of existence, while philosophers influenced by Aristotle and Plotinus, such as Ibn Sina, Avicenna, maintained that the universe flowed necessarily from God's being as light from the sun without a first moment, so that while it depended on God, it never came from nothing in a temporal sense. And this subtle tension over what it meant for something to begin later seeped into the intellectual bloodstream of medieval Christendom through translations in Toledo and Sicily. Within these debates, the concept of a vacuum resurfaced in a new idiom. If God is omnipotent, could he create a region of space entirely devoid of bodies, a perfect nothing between things, or would that contradict the structure of reality? And some theologians, eager to exalt God's freedom, answered that yes, an absolute void is logically possible because God could maintain distances without any intervening medium, whereas others, following a more Aristotelian line, hesitated to grant coherence to such a space, fearing they would be smuggling contradiction into the divine power itself. In the monasteries and universities of medieval Europe, under vaulted stone ceilings where Latin disputations echoed, the question of nothingness recurred in two distinct forms, as the metaphysical puzzle of creation ex nihilo, and as the physical puzzle of whether a vacuum could exist. So scholars like Thomas Aquinas insisted that to create from nothing did not mean that nothing was This metaphysical picture made God the answer to a question that would be famously articulated centuries later by Leibniz. Why is there something rather than nothing? But in Aquinas' day, he posed it more obliquely, asking why the essence of a thing does not include existence itself, and concluding that only in God are essence and existence identical, whereas in creatures they are united contingently, like a garment that could be taken off at any instant, leaving behind nothing at all, not even a corpse of the world. In the realm of physics, however, medieval Latin thinkers began poking practical holes in Aristotle's horror vacui, both theoretically and experimentally, so the condemned propositions of the Parisian bishop Etienne Tempier in 1277, meant to curb over-reliance on Aristotle, unintentionally liberated speculation by allowing Latin scholars to assert that God could move the world in a straight line, could create multiple worlds, and could, in principle, make a vacuum, because his power is not chained to Aristotle's arguments. And with this new room for thought, figures like Jean Buridan and Nicole Oresme began to examine whether air really rushes into a vacated space because nature hates emptiness, or because of more mundane physical forces. Early pneumatic experiments by engineers and artisans, who watched water refuse to rise in pumps above a certain height, dislodged confidence in the old explanation that nature was tugging the fluid upward to prevent a gap, and rumours of partial vacua formed in the barrels of pumps or inside glass vessels circulated as curiosities, preparing the way for the more dramatic experiments of the 17th century, when men would stand in public squares and show crowds that you could weigh the weight of air and, by removing it, approximate an emptiness that Aristotle had said could not be. In Renaissance Italy, Evangelista Torricelli devised a way to trap emptiness in a glass tube, filling a long tube with mercury, inverting it into a basin, and seeing the column fall and stabilize, leaving a strange shimmering space at the top with no visible substance. And he wrote cautiously that this space was, at least, free of air and mercury, which forced him and his contemporaries to ask whether it contained anything at all or whether it might be the elusive vacuum itself. And when Blaise Pascal repeated and extended these experiments, carrying tubes up mountains and watching the column fall as the air thinned, the old Aristotelian cosmos cracked audibly. Still, denial lingered, and philosophers like Descartes insisted that extension and matter were identical, that space without matter was a contradiction in terms. So for him, what Torricelli called vacuum was only subtle matter, perhaps invisible, filling that region, and the entire universe was a plenum of vortices and swirling substance without gaps, whereas his great rival in celestial mechanics, Isaac Newton, embraced an almost shocking idea that the heavens above were filled with a genuine emptiness, an absolute space in which planets swung around the sun under the action of gravity acting at a distance, through no obvious medium at all. Newton's space was not quite nothing, because for him it had its own status, the sensorium of God, a vast, infinite, homogeneous frame of reference in which positions and motions could be defined, even if no bodies occupied them, and it was so central to his theory that he invoked a famous bucket of water spinning, its surface curving, to show that rotation had meaning even in the absence of surrounding bodies, as if space itself could feel the spin, and in this picture, nothingness became a stage with properties, invisible but very real. Gottfried Wilhelm Leibniz rebelled against this, arguing in his correspondence with Samuel Clarke that space must be nothing more than the order of coexisting things, and that to suppose empty space without bodies would be to populate reality with meaningless places that nothing occupies, a violation in his eyes of the principle that God does nothing in vain. And though their arguments revolved around symmetry and metaphysics, the underlying question was still the same old spectre. Can there be places where nothing at all exists? Or is such an idea a misuse of words? As the 18th century drew to a close, a Prussian professor named Immanuel Kant re-examined the old cosmological disputes with a new skeptical eye, claiming that when reason tries to answer questions like whether the world had a beginning in time or whether it extends infinitely in space, it generates antinomies, pairs of arguments that are equally convincing yet mutually contradictory, and he concluded that this happens because we overstep the boundaries of possible experience, treating space and time, which for him were forms of our intuition, as if they were things in themselves, so that the image of an absolute nothing prior to space and time lies beyond the reach of any concept we could legitimately form. While philosophy wrestled with limits, 19th century physicists filled the supposed void again with a very different kind of substance, the luminiferous ether, an invisible medium believed to pervade all of space, carrying light waves the way air carries sound, and textbooks describe this ether as perfectly elastic, weightless, and subtle beyond imagining, passing unhindered through solid matter while providing the scaffolding for electromagnetic vibrations. So even if the regions between planets were emptied of gas and dust, they could never be true nothingness because the ether was there, silently being everything the vacuum could not be. At the same time, the new science of thermodynamics introduced a different, almost apocalyptic sense of emptiness, the idea of heat death, a future state in which all temperature differences have evened out, no energy gradients remain to power engines or life, and the universe becomes a uniform bath of low-energy radiation and scattered particles, utterly inert, and writers of the era described this as a kind of final void, though strictly speaking it would still be full of particles and photons but devoid of structure, work and life, an emptiness of meaning rather than of matter. Then, at the dawn of the 20th century, the ether vanished like mist under the twin suns of relativity and experiment, because Michelson and Morley's precise interferometer experiments failed to detect the Earth's motion through any cosmic medium, and Einstein, in his special theory of relativity, showed that one could account for the constancy of the speed of a light and the relativity of simultaneity without an ether at all, treating the electromagnetic field itself as fundamental, and in his general theory he went even further, merging space and time into a four-dimensional space-time whose curvature is what we feel as gravity, so that even in the absence of matter, space-time can possess structure, warping and flexing like a fabric that is not woven from any underlying threads. Einstein's field equations admitted vacuum solutions, such as empty regions of spacetime where the energy-momentum tensor vanished. Yet the geometry could still curve, producing gravitational waves or a universe that expands or contracts in the absence of matter. And this meant that empty space was, in relativity, anything but featureless. It was dynamic, malleable, and capable of carrying ripples of geometry across light years. And in 1917, when Einstein tried to construct a static cosmological model, he introduced the cosmological constant, a kind of energy of empty space that could hold the universe in place, not realizing he was foreshadowing one of the central mysteries of modern nothingness. But even as space-time became a something, quantum theory quietly laid dynamite at the base of classical emptiness, starting with Max Planck's discovery that energy is quantized, and Niels Bohr's discrete atomic orbits, then Werner Heisenberg's uncertainty principle, which declared that you cannot fix both the position and momentum of a particle with arbitrary precision, and from this, later, came the realization that fields themselves, not just particles, must fluctuate, and that the lowest energy state, the vacuum, could never be perfectly still, because to pin its energy exactly would violate the uncertainty embedded in nature's fabric. Paul Dirac's relativistic equation for the electron led him to the bizarre image of a sea of negative energy states, fully filled with holes that behave like antiparticles. And though this sea was later reinterpreted, it hinted that what we called empty space might be more like a teeming ocean of virtual possibilities, foamier than the calm surface suggests. And in quantum electrodynamics, the vacuum becomes the ground state of the electromagnetic field, from which virtual particle-antiparticle pairs constantly flare into brief existence before annihilating, leaving behind tiny shifts in energy that can, in principle, be measured. Experiments finally caught up with these abstractions, as in the Lamb shift, where the energy levels of hydrogen deviate slightly from Dirac's prediction because of interactions with vacuum fluctuations, and in the Casimir effect, where two uncharged metal plates placed very close together in a vacuum experience an attractive force, explainable by the restricted modes of quantum fields between them. So even when experimenters pump a chamber free of all detectable gas, cool it, and isolate it from radiation, what remains, according to the theory that best describes the microworld, is not nothing but a restless structured ground state whose properties can push, pull, and subtly. Yet, while physics was discovering that supposed emptiness is full of fields, another revolution was unfolding in cosmology, triggered when Edwin Hubble, looking through the 100-inch telescope at Mount Wilson, saw that distant galaxies are all receding from us, with their light shifted toward the red, implying that space itself is expanding. And when this observation was combined with the general relativity solutions of Alexander Friedmann and Georges Lemaitre, the idea took shape that, if you rewind cosmic history, the universe must once have been denser and hotter, compressed into a state where the known laws of physics strain under the pressure. Lemaitre, a Belgian priest and physicist, suggested in 1931 that the universe began from a primeval atom, a single, enormously compact cosmic egg that exploded, not into pre-existing space, but into itself, as we would now say, as space expanded, and decades later, with the discovery of the cosmic microwave background radiation and the success of Big Bang nucleosynthesis in explaining the abundance of light elements, this hot origin scenario hardened into the standard cosmological model, leading many to talk, a bit loosely, of the universe emerging from nothing at the Big Bang. But when physicists pressed more carefully on this language, they found that their equations do not, in fact, describe a moment of literal nothingness. Rather, they trace space-time back to a kind of boundary or singular region where curvature and density grow without bound and the classical description breaks down. So Stephen Hawking and James Hartler proposed a no-boundary model in which time, near the origin, transforms into a spatial dimension, like the latitude lines near the Earth's pole, eliminating a sharp-edged beginning and replacing it with a smooth, rounded geometry, where asking what was before the Big Bang is as meaningless as asking what is north of the North Pole. Others, like Alexander Vilenkin, developed models in which the universe might tunnel into existence from a prior state described as nothing, borrowing language from quantum mechanics, where particles can cross classically forbidden regions, and Tryon, as early as 1973, speculated that our universe could be a quantum fluctuation of the vacuum, a bubble of space-time that popped out of a background whose total energy, accounting for the negative gravitational potential energy and the positive energy of matter and fields, might sum to zero so that, in a tantalizing way, the universe would cost nothing to create. Yet the careful reader notices that the nothing in these proposals is already highly structured. A quantum gravitational state space, a law-governed realm where tunneling events and fluctuations obey precise rules encoded in equations, and philosophers of science have pointed out that this nothing is closer to a very special something, a bare-bones but real mathematical physical substrate, than to the absolute non-being of metaphysical speculation, so that what physicists call nothing often means a vacuum state of fields subject to laws, which to a logician or a theologian is still a long way from sheer non-existence. In contemporary analytic philosophy, some thinkers have tried to sharpen this point by defining what absolute nothing would have to mean. No space, no time, no laws, no entities, no properties, not even the possibility of anything existing, a complete failure of there to be anything at all. And they have asked whether this notion is coherent, or whether it smuggles in the very things it tries to exclude, because as soon as one says there could have been nothing, one is already quantifying over a possibility space that exists in some sense, even if only conceptually. Quentin Miller-Sue, for instance, in his speculative realism, suggests that the contingency of everything that exists might imply a deeper, lawless hyper-chaos, a realm where even the laws of physics are not necessary. Yet he does not describe this as nothing but as a different kind of something, while others, like Peter van Inwagen, argue that the question, why is there anything at all, might not have an answer in human terms, and Bede Rundle suggests that the existence of something may be less mysterious than the supposed possibility of nothing, hauntingly turning the traditional question on its head. Meanwhile, continental philosophers and existentialists approached nothing from a very different angle, seeing it not as a cosmological origin, but as a feature of human experience. So Martin Heidegger, in his 1929 lecture, What is Metaphysics?, describes the nothing as what is revealed in profound boredom or anxiety, when the usual significance of beings recedes, and we confront the sheer that it is of the world. And he famously says that the nothing nothings, indicating that it is not a thing but an event of disclosure that lets beings appear as such. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being and Nothingness, analyses how consciousness negates, how when you enter a cafe expecting to meet a friend who is not there, the absence you feel is not merely the lack of a body at a table, but an experienced nothingness that your expectation creates, a gap in the texture of reality that did not exist before you walked in, suggesting that nothingness is intimately tied to the capacity of human beings to conceive what is not and to deny, to say. At the other end of the spectrum in East Asian thought, the Chinese notion of wu, often translated as non-being or nothingness, plays a more harmonious role, as in the Tao Te Ching's image of a wheel whose usefulness lies in the empty hub, or a room whose value is in the vacant space within its walls. So here, nothing is not an enemy of being but its collaborator, the silent partner that makes function possible, and this poetic, pragmatic appreciation of emptiness-shaped architecture, painting and meditation, where blankness on a scroll or silence between notes is as expressive as ink or sound. Japanese Zen, influenced by Chinese Chan, takes emptiness and nothingness into practice, with koans that dismantle conceptualizations, and the term mu, often translated as nothing or no, appears in famous dialogues, like the monk asking whether a dog has Buddha nature and receiving only moo as an answer. A nullification that is not a metaphysical claim about non-existence, but an invitation to drop the very framework of the question, so that in Zazen, seated meditation, one encounters a kind of lived nothing, not as a cosmological hypothesis, but as the calm, open field of awareness in which thoughts and sensations come and go. If we return from these cultural and philosophical vistas to physics again, the question of whether nothing has ever existed becomes even more intricate when we consider not just the beginning of our universe, but its possible end and the global structure that might surround it. Because models like eternal inflation suggest that our observable universe may be just one bubble in a vastly larger multiverse where inflating space-time continues endlessly, birthing pocket universes with varying properties so that the background nothing might instead be an eternally churning high-energy field never dropping to zero. Alternative quantum gravity approaches, like loop quantum cosmology, propose that the apparent Big Bang singularity is replaced by a bounce, where a previous contracting phase rebounds into expansion when densities reach a critical point, implying that there was no moment of absolute beginning and that the universe in some form has always existed, sidestepping the problem of creation from nothing by dissolving the very idea of a first instant, while other models toy with cyclic universes that expand, contract, and regenerate structure endlessly. In string theory, space-time itself is not fundamental but emerges from more basic entities, strings or branes vibrating in higher dimensional spaces, with vacua corresponding to different configurations of these underlying elements, and the so-called landscape of string vacua comprises an enormous number of possible low-energy states, each with its own effective laws, so that an apparent vacuum is actually a particular arrangement within a vast possibility space, all of which makes the search for an absolute void look more like an attempt to peel away an onion whose core keeps receding. From the perspective of quantum field theory, even if one could somehow reach the lowest possible energy configuration of all fields, the zero-point fluctuations remain, and calculations of the vacuum energy density, naively done, yield a value for the cosmological constant that is absurdly larger than what we observe through the universe's gentle accelerated expansion, a discrepancy known as the cosmological constant problem, suggesting that we still do not understand what nothing is doing to gravity on the larger scales, or maybe that we are misinterpreting what the vacuum's energy really means. The discovery in the late 1990s that distant supernovae were dimmer than expected, indicating that cosmic expansion is accelerating, implied that some form of dark energy permeates space, contributing a constant or slowly varying energy density that acts repulsively on the cosmic scale, and the simplest model of this dark energy is precisely Einstein's old cosmological constant, a property of space itself, making even a cubic centimetre of empty vacuum contain a tiny but finite amount of energy that shapes the fate of galaxies, so that far from being nothing, vacuum appears to be the main ingredient of the cosmos. Psychologists and cognitive scientists watching children reason about emptiness have found that even young minds resist the idea of a total nothing. Asked what lies in an apparently empty box, children will often say, air, and when told the box contains nothing at all, they may imagine darkness, or a feeling, or some invisible stuff. And adults too, when they try to visualize nothingness, typically picture in mathematics the invention of zero as a symbol, and the concept of the empty set provided tools to speak rigorously about nothing within formal systems. Yet even there, the empty set is a definite object, the unique set that has no members, and from it, and a few axioms, one can construct whole hierarchies of number systems, so that, paradoxically in pure mathematics, the road to infinite structures passes through a carefully defined nothing that is not an absence of math, but one of its fundamental building blocks. Computer science, as it emerged in the 20th century, encoded a related notion in the idea of null pointers, empty strings, and Boolean false, each a precise representation of no value or no data, and bugs featuring null pointer exceptions demonstrate how stubbornly something tries to happen even when a program expects nothing to be there, mirroring, in a small way, the way our thoughts stumble over the edge of conceptual emptiness and inadvertently reify it. Religious mystics from different traditions and centuries often describe encounters with a kind of nothing at the heart of their visions, speaking of the via negativa, the way of negation, by which God is approached not by adding attributes but by stripping them away. God is not finite, not bounded, not temporal, not spatial, until what remains seems like nothing and everything at once. And Christian apophatic theologians, Muslim Sufis, and Jewish Kabbalists sometimes converge in portraying the divine as an abyss, an ayin or no-thing beyond all categories, such that what a physicist calls nothing and what a mystic calls nothing point in very different, yet strangely overlapping directions. The 20th century's brush with annihilation, 2 world wars, genocides, nuclear weapons, etched a different image of nothingness into culture, where the mushroom cloud and the idea of complete erasure of cities awakened in the collective mind a concrete, terrifying sense of what it would mean for everything familiar to vanish, and existentialist literature and theatre, from Beckett's characters waiting for someone who never comes to Kafka's figures, lost in indifferent bureaucracies, translated metaphysical nothing into social and personal emptiness, a world drained of meaning instead of matter. Meanwhile, in the laboratory, high-energy physics smashed protons together at ever-increasing speeds, converting mass into showers of new particles, demonstrating the ease with which one form of something could become another in modern alchemy, but never quite touching an absolute zero of being, because even when particles annihilate into photons, the fields that allowed their existence remain, and in the mathematics governing these reactions, symmetries and conservation laws persist like the grammar of a language that can be spoken in endlessly varied stories. Cosmologists estimate that the baryonic matter, the ordinary atoms forming stars, planets, people, constitutes only a small fraction of the universe's total content, with dark matter and dark energy making up the balance, and this revelation that what we see is a thin frosting on a vast, invisible cake of unknown substances and energies transforms our intuitive contrast between full and empty, because the regions of space we once thought vacant may, in reality, be thick with dark matter halos and suffused with dark energy, their physical impact detectable only through subtle gravitational signatures. And so, whether you follow the path of ancient myths conjuring oceans out of the unlit cosmos, or Greek philosophers banishing the void as a logical impossibility, or medieval theologians defending a creation from absolutely nothing while denying that nothing is any kind of stuff, or early modern experiments coaxing vacuums into glass tubes while metaphysicians debate whether those vacuums are real, or 20th century physicists discovering that their most refined version of emptiness is buzzing with fluctuations, energies, and potentials, you notice a pattern. Every time human understanding tries to carve out a pure, uncontaminated nothing, it finds that the vacuum left behind is already seeded with structure, law, relation, or meaning, as if the very act of thinking cannot help but embroider absence with a faint, inescapable presence. The question, did nothing ever exist, thus lingers, suspended between physics and philosophy, between what our best theories say about the earliest instance of our universe and what our concepts can coherently grasp. And while some models point toward a universe without a temporal beginning, others to a quantum tunneling from a minimalist pre-state, and still others to an emergent space-time rising from deeper, non-spatio-temporal substrates, none have yet presented us with a confirmed, empirically grounded picture of a moment when there was no space-time, no fields, no laws, and no possibilities at all, leaving us with a peculiar realization that nothing, in the fullest, most absolute sense, may be less something that once was and more a boundary to thought itself, a mirror in which every age has seen reflected, yet even that recognition, that our language about nothingness keeps reflecting ourselves back to ourselves, has its own genealogy, and if you listen closely you can almost hear it beginning in a poem sung beside an ancient river in India, where a Vedic seer recited the Nasadiya Sukta, the hymn of creation, and dared to say that in the beginning there was not only no world, no sky, no gods, but also no above or below, no distinguishing of what is and what is not, a murky state where even the distinction between being and non-being had not yet appeared, and the poet ends not with certainty but with a shrug that echoes across millennia. Perhaps the one who brought this universe forth knows how it began, or perhaps even he does not. That hymn does something unusual in the history of cosmogonies. It does not immediately fill the pre-world with water, serpents, or a conscious creator. Instead, it lingers in a conceptual twilight, a neither nor that makes you feel how fragile the boundary between something and nothing really is. And later, Indian schools would reinterpret that ambiguity through their own lenses, some seeing in it an ineffable positive ground, others a liminal fog that precedes any stable metaphysical picture, so that within one ancient text you already glimpse the tension between mythic story and philosophical restraint about what before might mean. Jain thinkers, crafting an entirely different cosmology on the subcontinent, rejected a temporal beginning altogether, insisting that the universe, with its living souls and non-living matter, its motion and rest, has no first moment and no creator, so the binary between something and nothing is rearranged. There is always something of some kind, arranged in endlessly cycling cosmic orders, and the question of whether nothing ever existed simply never arises, because for them, as for many other traditions, the more urgent issue is how sentient beings move through this eternally existing structure, rather than where it came from. If you cross westward again, but stay in late antiquity, you find Stoic philosophers facing the atomist void with a very different conviction, asserting that the cosmos is a single living being, a fiery, rational organism filled with pneuma, a kind of active, breath-like substance that permeates every region and binds all parts into a coherent whole, so that outside the outermost conflagrating sphere might lie an empty region. But within the world itself there is no room, literally, for a true vacuum. What looks like emptiness is just a looser, more rarefied configuration of the same divine breath. The Stoic insistence on a completely full, sympathetically linked universe had ethical as well as physical implications, because it underwrote the idea that every event is connected to every other by chains of cause, that fate is a rational web, and that one's own soul participates in the same substance as the stars. So in that sense they feared nothingness, not only as a physical impossibility but as a moral one, since genuine gaps in being would threaten the continuity of reason permeating the cosmos, and they preferred a world thick with causal threads to an existence vulnerable to stray holes of non-being. Centuries later, Jewish philosophers wrestling with Greek metaphysics and biblical revelation approached the same conceptual precipice from yet another angle, and Moses Maimonides, in his Guide for the Perplexed, tried to show that the doctrine of creation, ex nihilo, though not demonstrable by reason alone in his view, faithfully expressed the Torah's teaching that all contingent beings depend radically on God, yet he also argued that our minds cannot truly grasp what it would mean for the world to have absolutely not been, since every faculty we use to imagine absence is trained on modifications of presence, not on its complete eradication. Mystical currents within Judaism pushed the theme even further, especially in the Kabbalistic notion of tzimtzum, the contraction of the infinite, where the Ein Sof, the boundless divine, is said to have withdrawn or concealed itself to make place for a finite world. And in this symbolic drama, a paradox appears. There must be an empty zone for creation to occur, yet that emptiness cannot be truly devoid of God, because nothing can exist outside the infinite. So Kabbalists speak of an emptiness that is not really empty, a cleared space that is at once abandonment and veiled presence, perhaps one of the most striking religious attempts to imagine a quasi-nothing that is thick with hidden fullness. This paradoxical emptiness, the Ein that is both no thing and the womb of all things, reappears in the diagrams of the Sephirot, the emanations through which divinity flows into the many, and medieval practitioners meditated on these images with the conviction that penetrating the layers of being would bring them closer to that inscrutable non-being at the root of all, an experience likened in their writings not to falling into a blank void, but to being consumed by an overwhelming dark light. And in Islamic Kalam, the theologians who defended divine omnipotence went so far as to atomize not only matter but also time, proposing that the world consists of discrete atoms and accidents recreated at every instant by God's will, and that what persists is not an enduring substance but an ever-renewed series of momentary existences, which means that between any two instants there yawns, conceptually, a potential nothingness, a gap in which God could choose not to recreate the next slice of reality, and yet in their doctrine he never does, so the world rides on a razor's edge above absolute non-being every fraction of a second while never actually falling in. This occasionalist picture, where causation is reduced to the custom of God and continuity is an illusion built from discontinuous acts of creation, turns our earlier question on its head, because it makes nothing, not a distant primordial state, but the always available counterfactual, the ever-present alternative to the fact that there is a next moment and a next. And in this sense, nothingness lurks as the shadow of every existing thing, not as a past reality, but as the possibility forever narrowly avoided. When the Renaissance in Europe revived classical learning, humanists and natural philosophers inherited this long, tangled legacy of fullness and void, creation and eternity, and against that backdrop, Otto von Guericke's famous demonstration in 1654 of his Magdeburg hemispheres, two metal shells evacuated of air and then pulled apart only by teams of straining horses, had immediate dramatic impact precisely because it provided the populace with a visceral spectacle of near emptiness exerting strength, a nothing so tenacious that multiple animals could not separate it, forcing educated and uneducated alike to reconsider what might dwell in places that seem to contain no thing. Robert Boyle, working with his air pump in England, turned such spectacles into systematic research, defining a pneumatic state and cataloguing how flames died, sound diminished, and small animals struggled when placed in his evacuated chambers. And although his experiments convinced him that vacua of some degree really could be manufactured, he simultaneously maintained that even these spaces were not deprived of God's presence, infusing his mechanical philosophy with a theologically tinged conviction that however empty matter might become, it could never expel the divine. As more refined instruments allowed lower and lower pressures, the everyday intuition that empty space is just nothing began to invert. The harder it became technically to remove gases and stray molecules, the more nothingness seemed like an achievement, a fragile technological artifact. So by the time 20th century vacuum technology produced ultra-high vacua for semiconductor fabrication and particle experiments, the word vacuum had come to mean not metaphysical non-existence but a carefully prepared stage on which the subtlest behaviour of matter could be observed. A human-made approximation to an ideal nothing that nature itself never spontaneously presents. In the salons of the Enlightenment, however, debates over nothing took a more abstract and often more politically charged tone, with French materialists such as Baron d'Holbach publishing massive clandestine treatises arguing that the universe is nothing but matter in motion, and that talk of creation from nothing is a relic of priestcraft, while Voltaire skewered both scholastic metaphysics and naive deism with satire, treating nothing as a rhetorical bogeyman used to intimidate the credulous, and preferring to imagine an eternal succession of worlds or configurations of matter, in which asking about a first beginning is like searching for the earliest circle in a chain with no link privileged over another. Kant's critical turn, which tried to show the limits of speculative reason, did not end these discussions. Instead, it set the stage for Georg Wilhelm Friedrich Hegel, who in his Science of Logic began his dialectic precisely with the concepts of pure being and pure nothing, claiming that both are so indeterminate that they collapse into each other, and that the truth of both is becoming, a dynamic unity and difference. So for Hegel, nothing is not a barren void, but a necessary counterpart to being in the unfolding of thought, and history itself becomes the theatre in which this shifting identity is worked out in ever richer forms. This Hegelian vision, in which nothingness is a moment in a dialectical process rather than a static state, influenced not only academic philosophy, but revolutionary politics, because if the real is rational and unfolds historically, then the negation of a given social order is not simple destruction into nothingness, but a determinate step to, in parallel, mathematicians probing the infinite developed tools that forced them to formalize emptiness with new precision, and Georg Cantor, exploring sets of different sizes of infinity in the late 19th century, defined the empty set not as a philosophical flourish but as a foundational object, the set with no elements, from which, via iterative operations, one can generate the natural numbers, so that in modern set theory, nothingness is not a threat to structure but its silent seed, a carefully defined absence that becomes the starting point of an immense, abstract universe. Cantor's revelations about infinite sets led to paradoxes and crises that shook the foundations of mathematics in the early 20th century, prompting figures like David Hilbert to propose formal axiom systems that included the empty set as a primitive, and others like L. E. J. Brouwer to develop intuitionism, which questioned whether the existence of mathematical objects independent of construction made sense. And though their arguments concerned numbers and proofs, the shadow of nothingness was there, because to ask whether a set exists or not, or whether a proof establishes reality or mere consistency, is to hover over the gap between something and its absence in one of the most rigorously defined arenas of human thought. When philosophers of modality like Saul Kripke and later David Lewis elaborated possible world semantics, They imported the idea of an empty world into logic itself, a possible world in which nothing exists at all, no objects, no minds, no spatio-temporal framework, serving as a limiting case to test definitions of necessity and possibility, and Lewis taking the bold step of treating all possible worlds as concretely existing in a vast pluriverse, still had to decide whether an empty world is among them, leading to intricate arguments about whether the very notion of a world with no inhabitants is coherent, or whether world already in the physical sciences, attention turned not only to the beginning but also to potential failure modes of the vacuum itself, because quantum field theory, when combined with cosmology, allows for the possibility that what we call the vacuum may be a false vacuum, a metastable phase that could, in principle, transition to a lower energy true vacuum through a process analogous to bubble nucleation in a supercooled liquid. And in such a scenario, a tiny region of space would spontaneously flip into the new state and expand at nearly the speed of light, rewriting the laws of physics inside its growing bubble and annihilating all structures, a ruthless, impersonal route toward a universe far emptier, or at least far less hospitable to anything we would recognize. This thought experiment, first articulated in technical terms by Sidney Coleman and collaborators, acquired a chilling vividness when popular accounts pointed out that if such a vacuum decay event were possible, there would be no warning, no way to detect the incoming phase boundary, and no survivors to observe it. So in a strange twist, one theoretical path from something toward a kind of cosmic erasure is unobservable in principle. If it ever happens, there will be no one inside our current vacuum to say that the universe has collapsed into a lonelier, perhaps simpler, form, leaving only speculations in the meanwhile about whether our vacuum's apparent stability is a temporary grace or an eternal condition. Black hole physics added a different approach to nothing, because regions of collapsed matter so dense that escape velocity exceeds the speed of light carve holes in spacetime itself, hiding their interiors behind event horizons, and from the standpoint of an external observer, the infalling matter appears to freeze and fade at the horizon, its information smeared out in ways that provoked deep puzzles. Does the black hole interior harbour a singularity, a breakdown of known physics where curvature diverges, or does quantum gravity replace that apparent geometric nothing with some new, still unknown structure that preserves information in a non-classical form? Stephen Hawking's discovery that black holes radiate thermally because of quantum effects near the event horizon, slowly losing mass and eventually evaporating, made the idea of a black hole as an eternal graveyard for information suspect, and the resulting information paradox forced theorists to rethink what emptiness and absence mean at the most fundamental level, leading to proposals like the holographic principle, which suggest that the information content of a region of space is encoded on its boundary surface, as if what we call a volume filled with or devoid of stuff is really a projection of bits inscribed on a distant screen, undermining any naive notion of an empty interior. The idea, championed by Gerard 't Hooft and Leonard Susskind and given concrete form in the ADSA CFT correspondence by Juan Maldacena, hints that the true degrees of freedom of the universe might live on lower dimensional boundaries, turning the very question of whether there are empty regions inside into something like a question about whether there are blank sectors in a gigantic ledger, and if that is so, then the old image of a three-dimensional void waiting to be filled with particles is replaced by a more abstract picture, in which emptiness is a matter of unexcited degrees of freedom in a vast information-theoretic structure. Physicist John Archibald Wheeler's playful slogan, "It from bit," encapsulated this shift, suggesting that every physical object, every field, every spatio-temporal region derives its reality from binary choices, from yes-no answers, to questions posed at the most fundamental level, and in such a framework, nothing might correspond not to the absence of the informational substrate, but to the uniformity of its states, a kind of maximum ignorance or minimum structure, so that again the attempt to imagine absolute nothingness is thwarted by the indispensability of some underlying register in which even null values must be recorded. Information theory, born from Claude Shannon's work on communication channels, reinforces this intuition by defining information as the resolution of uncertainty among possible states, so that a completely predictable, uniform system carries minimal information, while a system with many possible configurations and no bias among them carries maximal entropy. And in this technical sense, a featureless thermal equilibrium is not nothing, but a very specific kind of everything, a state in which all microscopic possibilities consistent with the macroscopic constraints are realized with equal likelihood, undermining the short leap people sometimes make from structureless to non-existent. As cosmologists extend these tools to the universe as a whole, they consider futures in which our cosmos approaches a de sitter phase, dominated by dark energy, where space continues to expand exponentially, pushing galaxies beyond each other's horizons until only a few gravitationally bound islands remain, and even those gradually dissolve into radiation and stray particles. Yet even that bleak picture may not be a perfectly inert nothing, because quantum fluctuations in de sitter space can, in principle, give rise to rare, spontaneously assembled configurations, so-called Boltzmann brains or even entire low-entropy patches that briefly mimic structured universes, implying that in an eternally lasting vacuum, transient pockets of something will keep flickering out of the dominant almost nothing forever. These unsettling implications lead some physicists and philosophers to question whether such an eternally fluctuating vacuum is a coherent description of reality, or whether our probabilistic tools break down in regimes where most observers, defined in some measure, would be freak fluctuations rather than evolved beings. And the resulting measure problems in cosmology show that even at the farthest extrapolations of physical theory, the distinction between something and nothing is not easily drawn. Instead, one confronts ensembles of possibilities in which emptiness and fullness intermingle in unintuitive ways. Meanwhile, disciplines far from cosmology were staging their own encounters with nothing, often in laboratories geared not toward the cosmos but toward the human mind. So sensory deprivation experiments, beginning with isolation tanks in the 1950s, subjected volunteers to environments with minimal light, sound, and tactile stimulation in an attempt to see how the brain copes with near-empty input, and reports quickly made clear that rather than settling into a neutral grey nothing, consciousness fills the void with hallucinations, intensified internal dialogues, and distorted body images, as if the psyche is constitutionally incapable of simply resting in a pure silence of experience. Artists and composers translated this psychological insight into aesthetic experiments, most famously in John Cage's piece 433, in which performers remain silent for the titular duration, forcing the audience to confront the ambient sounds of the environment, coughs, shifting chairs, distant traffic, as the actual content of the work, and Cage, influenced by Zen, later recounted that his visit to an anechoic chamber had revealed not the nothing he expected, but two persistent sounds, one high and one low, corresponding to his nervous system and blood circulation, persuading him that there is no true silence, only the ceaseless activity of life and environment filling even the most carefully crafted emptiness. In the visual arts, Kazimir Malevich's Black Square hung like a void on the walls of early 20th century exhibitions, a simple, stark field of black paint that critics hailed or derided as the 0 point of painting, a deliberate reduction of image to an almost pure absence. And in the decades that followed, minimalist artists explored blank canvases, monochrome fields, and empty rooms as legitimate works, inviting viewers to project their own meaning into the void and discover that what seems like nothing on first glance can teem with associations, memories, and subtle nuances once one lingers. Architects and designers, especially in Japanese and Scandinavian traditions, used negative space, uncluttered rooms, and bare walls as central elements rather than residual non-features, teaching the eye to see emptiness as a positive presence that frames and highlights the few objects intentionally placed within it. And in such settings, the absence of ornament or furniture is not a defect, but a carefully curated nothing, aesthetically charged, which in turn influences how people move, speak, and think within those spaces, showing again that what we label nothing can wield power precisely by patterning our behaviour. On the scale of personal existence, therapists and psychiatrists began in the 20th century to recognise a particular kind of suffering, described by patients not as acute pain, but as a chronic sense of emptiness, a felt internal void often associated with depression, trauma, or certain personality disorders, where the individual reports feeling hollow, unreal, or like a shell. And treatment involves not filling that felt nothing with a random flurry of activities or substances, but slowly building stable relationships, narratives, and capacities that reconnect the person. In literature, writers such as Fyodor Dostoevsky, Virginia Woolf, and later Samuel Beckett portrayed characters grappling with a creeping erosion of meaning, a sense that God is silent, society is unreliable, and the self is fragmented, so that the great void they face is not a cosmic vacuum but an existential one, a collapse of purposes and values that leaves them staring into what seems like nothing at the center of their lives, and their struggles dramatize in human scale the same dread that metaphysicians feel when they contemplate a universe that might, conceivably, have failed to exist. Through all these cultural, scientific, and philosophical episodes, one can notice that the idea of nothing has functioned as a kind of stress test for worldviews. Whenever a religion, a theory, or an art movement wanted to articulate how absolute or how contingent its central commitments are, it has asked whether, in some real or imaginary dimension, we could have had nothing instead, and the responses have ranged from outright denial, nothing is impossible, to hesitant admission coupled with faith or hope, to cool acceptance mixed with awe, each stance revealing not only what people think the world is, but also how they cope emotionally with the possibility of its absence. In modern fundamental physics, attempts to quantize gravity and unify it with the other forces have even led to the proposal that space-time itself may be emergent from deeper pre-geometric entities, such as networks, spin foams, or algebraic relations. And in these approaches, what we took to be the void between things dissolves into a highly structured combinatorial substratum, in which adjacency, causality, and volume are derived rather than basic, so that the old question of empty versus full regions inside space is displaced by a new question about whether the underlying graph or algebra can possess a state of zero occupation, or whether some minimal tapestry of relations must always be there. Digital physics speculations from Konrad Zus's Rechnender Raum to more recent cellular automaton models. At the other end of the intellectual spectrum, some contemporary theologians, informed by modern cosmology, have revisited creation ex nihilo in light of quantum beginnings, proposing that God's creative act might be understood not as a temporal event at the first instant, but as a timeless grounding of the entire space-time manifold, including whatever quantum vacuum or pre-geometric structures underlie it. And in this reframing, nothing is not a prior condition, but a contrast term, indicating that without this grounding, there would be no reality of any kind, no lawfulness, no place for even virtual particles to flicker, and that whatever physics discovers about vacua still concerns only intracreational structures. Within atheistic or non-theistic frameworks, other thinkers respond by suggesting that seeking an explanation beyond the totality of existence may be a category error, that the universe or multiverse is simply the brute fact, and questions about why there is something rather than nothing are misplaced demands for causes in a domain where cause and effect no longer apply, much as asking what lies north of the North Pole misunderstands the structure of the Earth, and in this view, nothingness is a useful counterfactual for exploring contingency within the world, but not a real option against which the whole of reality stands. Emerging technologies, especially in virtual and augmented reality, are beginning to give everyday users direct experiences of constructed spaces where nothing can be switchable and layered, because a programmer can code an environment where a gesture erases objects instantly, leaving behind a mathematical void of pure background color, yet that digital emptiness floats upon a complex stack of hardware and software, from GPU shaders to network protocols, so the user's seeming power to conjure nothing with a handwave is, in fact, the apex of millions of lines of code working flawlessly. Another reminder that what we casually label as nothing often hides a tremendous amount of unseen structure. As climate change, biodiversity loss, and cultural homogenization accelerate in our own century, activists and artists alike deploy images of emptiness, deforested landscapes, bleached coral reefs, deserted villages, as warnings of a more local, but for us more immediate, slide toward nothing. The disappearance of particular forms of life, languages, and traditions, each extinction a small pocket of non-being created where once there was a unique configuration of something, and while this is far from the metaphysical void, the cumulative emotional impact of such losses gives the word nothing a new urgency, tied not to the absence of all being, but but to the increasingly plausible prospect of our own absence from the cosmic story. You could say, tracing this immense arc from the first myths of primeval waters to contemporary equations of quantum vacua, from mystics yearning toward the hidden no-thing at the core of divinity, to engineers sweating over the last residual gas molecules in a vacuum chamber, from poets describing the hollowness of a lonely soul, to logicians sketching empty possible worlds, that humanity has never stopped circling the question of whether nothing has ever really had its day, or whether every attempt to imagine such a day ends up populating it with shadows, laws, or at least the thin outline of a viewer. And so the history of this question becomes, in its own way, a history of our refusal, perhaps our inability, to let go entirely of the conviction that in some form, however strange or unfamiliar, there must always be something rather than an absolute unqualified, irretrievable nothing at all.